Today, with great pleasure, we welcome Dr. Michael Ungar to our discussion. Dr. Ungar is a renowned expert and scholar in the field of resilience, with decades of experience dedicated to understanding and supporting individuals, families, and communities facing adversity. Through his extensive research, insightful writings, and engaging presentations, Dr. Unger has provided invaluable insights into fostering resilience and promoting positive outcomes, particularly for children and youth dealing with trauma and challenging life circumstances. Today, we have the privilege of delving into some key themes from his work, exploring strategies for supporting our students, addressing societal challenges, and fostering hope in our communities. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Ungar. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Madame Maikai, Reine Maikai is the principal of Blessed Sacrament School in Vancouver, British Columbia, and she would like to lead us with our first question this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Ungar, and thank you again for your time today. In your recent talk at the Catholic Educators Conference in Vancouver, you briefly touched upon the challenges and opportunities in faith-based educational settings. Keeping in mind the spiritual perspective, do you have suggestions or strategies to help students increase their confidence in their abilities and provide them with opportunities to serve their community?
What a great question. And it's interesting that in this conversation about what makes us resilient under stress, it's not always talked about that spiritual or faith-based element. And indeed, in a lot of our work across cultures, it does appear as a theme. And I think that for young people, if you begin to think about, well, one, that handing down of spirituality, that handing down of values is often a bit of a guide for decision-making. But it's also about embedding yourself into a cultural tradition. So one's faith, one's spirituality also anchors you to your culture and a set of values and practices. And those can often be a bit of like a compass direction for you when you're in a very tough situation. In our own studies of resilience, we look at that. We see that young people have a morality, a sense of what's right and what's wrong, tend to be able to withstand stressful situations that much better. And the other side of a faith community, if you're more formal in terms of what we're talking about here as religion, is often that's also an opportunity to connect to other aspects. So it creates some structure in your life. It gives you a place to go on a certain time in the week. It creates routines. It gives you some holidays, some rituals in your life. And then what we've also found is many of those things make us feel like the world is a safer, more predictable place. And that also has an ability to help us withstand, that anxiety or depression, some of the things that can actually weigh us down. So, the more we attach to our spirituality, the more we attach, if that's expressed through a religion, it often goes hand in hand with what makes us more resilient.
Thank you. Makes sense to me.
Thank you so much. I will now play a pre-recorded question from Jeanne. She is a teacher in Wisconsin, USA.
In your book, The We Generation, you explore the challenges that young people face in today's interconnected society. What are some of these unique challenges? Additionally, considering the prevalence of technology in youth culture, do you believe it's possible to transform young people's potential addiction to technology into a force for positive social change? Thank you.
This is a really interesting thing that we need to think more about, which I have been talking about in We Generation, other books, is this idea that our children want to be connected. But it does worry me that in many places around the world, children are very much supervised, or there's a hyper-vigilant, overprotective parent that actually, in a sense, separates the child from their community. I don't see as much evidence that one of the things that we keep discovering about this idea of us being able to cope under stress is us also being able to genuinely contribute to the welfare of others.
Oh, so sorry. We're going to have to restart. Everyone, please make sure you are muted. And Dr. Ungar, please unmute yourself. I muted the wrong person.
Let me do that again. So it is a really good question, because what it highlights is that, as I've said in WeGeneration, many other places in my work, is that what we keep seeing is that young people who seem to be able to cope with stress better are also ones that have a genuine opportunity to contribute to someone else's welfare. And when we're in, some societies these days are like into this kind of hyper vigilant, really trying to overprotect children, not asking of them anything. We don't ask them to walk the dog or do chores. We sort of bubble wrap them. We don't give them any responsibilities. And that seems to undermine their ability to see themselves as competent, caring contributors to their communities. So that's super important. And yes, actually, this idea of that somehow children being online is necessarily a problem doesn't necessarily bear out by the evidence. Now, certainly, if you're online 8 hours a day, that's a problem. But a young person, the research is sort of showing that if you're actively engaged in a community online, whether it's a gaming community or some sort of social movement, what the evidence is saying is that as long as I'm actually participating or uploading content into that community, I'm more active as opposed to passively just watching, videos. If I'm active online, there is at least a neutral or potentially positive effect on young people's ability to cope with stress. So, we find our communities many places, but the trick is, whether it's in person or online, is to contribute. And when you make a contribution, it has a sort of a feedback loop that actually makes it so that you are able to cope with stress much better too.
Thank you so much on behalf of Jeanne in Wisconsin. Right now, I will move to very special teachers in our network, and they are in Kyiv. And one of these teachers had a student report a question for you about the situation over there. Hello.
Hello, I'm Karina Lakosnik. I'm student of the National Academy of Internal Affairs, future lawyer. I have a question what avoided for me and many students which are facing with the stress due to study, family troubles, first losses, and all of this had double ruined effect during wartime on our health. How to develop stress resistance in yourself, to ignore situation in which you cannot change anything. Many nights we are spending in basements, eyes filled with fear and anxiety that does not disappear from people's hearts in the morning. How to deal with the anxiety, fear, panic attacks that have been bothering me since the beginning of the full-scale invasion from Russia.
What a great question, and voiced so well, and a problem and a challenge for many, unfortunately, way too many young people around the world, including in Ukraine. There is no simple answer to this question. What I can do in a very sort of perhaps superficial way is mention that when we have studied, and studies have taken place in zones of war, what they have found that people like the young woman we just heard are going to cope better is when people, first of all, let's just start with, think about it as different systems nested together. So there's a cognitive or inside our head element of, obviously not blaming ourselves for the situation by maintaining some perspective of hope that things are going to get better. Not endlessly, focused on just the negative. because that tends to just bring our mood down continuously. But finding any glimmer, anything that you can be grateful for at the end of every day, even if it is just a small thing, and trying to surround yourself with some semblance of hope. But it's also about other systems. It's about making sure that you connect with those in any way that you can who are able to support you. You know, the more we're embedded in a group of people with a common, in a sense, a common suffering, or at least a common vision for the future, the more likely we are to have our mood lifted and be a little bit more able to resist the impact of anxiety and stress. But saying that, I want to offer a caution. What we also know is that stress, that external constant exposure to bombardment, gets under our skin in what's called an epigenetic process, in which those stressors get underneath, and they will sort of, in a sense, wear us down, sort of like water across rocks. And I do think that it's really important that people remember that, you know, if this does end, that on the surface we may be coping again, but give yourself the space afterwards to understand that it has taken an inner toll on you, a toll that might not appear, you know, until something breaks down a year later. And that's the way this kind of what's called allostatic stress kind of works. It wears you down from the inside, and you don't always see it. So pay attention to what that stress is doing, find others to communicate with, and as much as possible, you know, do work on the cognitive so that you're not catastrophizing, thinking the worst constantly. Though I understand how silly that advice might appear right now to Ukrainians as this war escalates and indeed has become quite a bit more dire. So I certainly, these techniques are not perfect, but they are what people have shown in other contexts.
Thank you, Doctor. Our hearts go out to, we pray for them every day, and we are thankful for them being a part of this exchange today. From Kivern, she's a teacher in Oshawa, Ontario.
Good morning. In Too Safe for Their Own Good, you talk about overprotective parents who can actually hinder resilience in young people. And you discuss how finding a balance between safety and the challenges is necessary. My question as a parent is, can you discuss some of the signs that my child may be overprotected or sheltered? And how can I gradually help my child be more resilient while keeping safe? And if you can answer that just from a lens of having very young kids to having kids who are teenagers, that would be really helpful.
You know, it's funny, here we just jumped from a conversation about children under context of war. And now we're in a context of often what are stable, loving families, where the issue is one of overprotection. Just as an aside to this, I would travel the world meeting with children in those contexts of war and deprivation, and looking at why many of them were able to survive, because they could make a contribution, because they maintained routines, maintained attachments, had decision-making power, felt some powerful identities that they could express to others. You know, all of these aspects of resilience. And then what was happening, I was coming back into my country, Canada, and seeing parents who were basically, you know, denying their child any decision-making power, not letting them take any responsibilities in the home, driving them everywhere if they could, controlling every aspect of their decision-making power, and then wondering why the children were showing anxiety and depression and other kind of mental health problems. And what I began to understand was that this overprotective parenting denies children the very building blocks of what we see in studies of resilience. So the answer is, in an age-appropriate way, to give your child opportunities to do those things, to make decisions for themselves, to make sure that they have opportunities to make a real contribution to their family and their community. So if you're going to take them to the soccer match, you know, busy getting food ready and stuff, are they packing up their own soccer gear and making sure that they're, you know, making a contribution to their team and figuring out what's going to happen and all of these things? And I'm talking as young as 8 or perhaps a little bit older. Like, do we understand that children have competencies, and giving them opportunities to use them so that they bolster up a positive identity of who they are, what they're capable of. We are so focused on the protection side of keeping the child away from danger that we haven't spent enough time thinking, what is the, in a sense, the product I want? What is it I want a child to be able to do? I want them to feel good about themselves, to understand how to help others, to be able to take responsibility, to make decisions. And that all has to be taught when they're young enough that I can coach them through their mistakes. And dare I say, we want our children, I have to use the four-letter F word here, the one that parents never want to use, which of course is fail. I want my child to fail in manageable ways that they can fix their own mistakes when they're young enough that the consequences aren't extreme. And a child who goes through that then has what is considered, what's sometimes referred to psychologically as the scaffolding, the support they need to develop the skill sets they need to cope with future stressors. I don't want my child arriving at college without having first understood that, how to make decisions, how to negotiate a grade, how to manage their own time, and how to make mistakes, come back from a mistake and fix it and get on with their life again. That seems to be our understanding of this, the dangers of overprotective parenting. It takes away those very building blocks for resilience.
Thank you so much. We have our very own Chris Ford in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Good morning, sir. And you have a question today.
Well, I do, but I think Crystal is here, so...
Yeah, we're still going to go with you, Chris. I talked to Crystal already.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm out in Treaty 6 territory, and here's my question for you today. How can teachers support Indigenous students dealing with intergenerational trauma while promoting Indigenous healing and reconciliation? So additionally, what strategies can they employ to ensure they are trauma-informed in their approach, especially within Indigenous communities? Are there any Indigenous-based resources or speakers you've encountered in your work that you would recommend for teachers to seek further guidance on these topics?
That's a great question, and one that is so relevant, not just in Canada, but also in the United States and Australia and a variety of other countries around the world as well, where there is now a spirit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'm not Indigenous, so I certainly don't want to overstep here my knowledge base. But when I enter spaces where I am encountering a lot of Indigenous youth, and actually I've seen some great examples of such interventions, what I see working is when you see elders from those very communities brought into what we often talk about as first voice, that it's their experiences and their narration of their experiences, and they're sort of almost making it normal, this conversation. They're bringing in those experiences into spaces so that it's not someone else over there, but it's just there's a proximity, right? Children respond really well when it's they can sort of ask questions and see people and hear the first accounts of what happened. That seems to be one of the ways that we embrace reconciliation, through those first voices, through that those stories being shared and told. In terms of working with children themselves, I often say work in partnership with those who know those kids and those stories. Work through community. Think about Indigenous ways of knowing, think about decolonizing some of the educational practices, which one means reflecting children in the curriculum, making sure those stories are there, but it also might mean more collectivist working together, less focus on individual accomplishments and more collective momentum and goodwill. And I say that only because that seems to be what my Indigenous scholars and colleagues have been telling me is a more of an indigenized curriculum, that one of collaboration, less individual focus, more and one that also integrates nature and a perspective on that. So, I'm always sort of guided, I'm always sort of the outsider looking in and saying, so tell me what would actually work? And then listening to youth talk about their experiences. It's a much more story-based, it's a much more land-based, it's a much more collectivist approach to whether we're talking education or dealing with mental health issues, it seems to be that kind of approach. I'm not an expert in that because I'm not Indigenous myself, but I defer to my colleagues to create that, that what sometimes referred to as two-eyed seeing in science, to combining a Western perspective and an Indigenous perspective on health and healing seems to, create a positive dialogue and conversation across disciplines. So look to elders, look to each other, tell stories, get out of the classroom and go into spaces where perhaps some Indigenous people might feel more comfortable. And when you start doing those things, I think you enter a space of reconciliation where people are much more respectful to what we each bring to the conversation and the strengths that we each bring as well. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
We have a live question from Cynthia in South Carolina, USA.
Good morning. Bonjour, my name is Cynthia Texera. I am a French immersion teacher at Sullivan IB Middle School in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So in my classrooms, we only speak French, so I will have my question in French and English for you. Basé sur votre livre Change the World, vous mentionnez la gentillesse et la défense de ce qui est juste sont importants et comment les petites actions conduisent à des changements importants. Notre question est la suivante. Comment est-ce que nous, jeunes citoyens du monde, pouvons-nous aider les enseignants, les élèves et les communautés qui nous entourent à être plus résilients et à mieux réussir? In English, based on your book, Change the World, you mentioned kindness and standing up for what is right being very important. How even the smallest actions can lead to significant changes. Our question is the following. How can we, young citizens of the world, be a force for good in helping teachers and students and the communities around us be more resilient and more successful?
Un grand merci pour la question. C'est très une bonne question aussi. So it's an interesting point, is that we do know that resilience is related. Our capacity to cope with stress, individually and collectively, is related to our experience of social justice. It bothers me sometimes when I read these questions. It's are itemized like, when times are tough, I persevere. When I'm in a tough situation, I know how to solve it. And what those questions do is they kind of put all the responsibility for change and support on our individual shoulders. So I much prefer questions like, when times are tough, I know how to cope, but are there other people and places and spaces that are going to help me? So suddenly it's much more about the collective, about our resilience is tied up to the resilience of our communities. Now I'm coming back to your question, which means that as an educator, and indeed as with the young people that you're working with, I think what I'm understanding is that when people make a small contribution to the welfare of others, when they feel like their identity is wrapped up with helping. I'll give you a small example. Like if we were going to run a self-esteem workshop in a school, they kind of always bother me because they're so focused on one little cognitive inner brain process. But our genuine self-esteem not only comes from having a positive attitude towards myself, but when the world looks at me as competent and giving back to something. So I want that same group of self-esteem trainees to come out of that little workshop that was done at the lunch hour or whatever, and then can go and do something that actually addresses bullying in their school. I want them to go into the community and look after stray animals if that's their thing. I want them to be seen. In a way, I want them to have a mirror back from the community so that when I look out, my community reflects back to me that I'm making a positive change. And if I might, generally speaking, the younger the child, the less abstract that can be. So if we're talking about elementary school kids, generally speaking, the idea of social justice and feeling like they're changing the world has to come from a more direct experience with that world. So they have to be, actually serving the food in the shelter. They have to be actually walking the dog. They have to be making something. They can't just send money for goats to wherever, But as the child gets older, the abstraction is much more possible. a letter back or a note or a video, suddenly that kind of more abstract thinking is possible. But it's the same stuff. I always say, find a small thing that we feel like we can change. That little tiny thing that we make a difference. Maybe it's just playing our, going to a senior's residence and entertaining if you play an instrument and you're 13 years old and putting on a little concert. Any little contribution, these aren't little, because the cumulative effect of those is that we then begin to say, we are making the world a better place. And yes, as Adam Grant and a few others who've looked at this idea of give and take talk about, there's a reciprocity in that, where we also are able to withstand more stress. And we feel like we're embedded in a community much better. So it is a little bit about, sharing and also finding places that we can excel and show we can show our best selves as well.
Right, merci. Another thing that we talk about with our students is, as teachers, is if the student knows that you generally have an interest in them and that you have one little tiny thing that you know about them, that makes a huge difference in educating them as well. So knowing your students is a big piece of it as well. And that sometimes we are the stable place that they have every day, and maybe home isn't. So that's why it's so important for teachers to hear this. So thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Docteur.
Oh, de rien, de rien. That, that's also a great point, is that that our schools, our institutions become places where children feel treated fairly. I often ask, one of our big questions in our surveys is, are you treated fairly somewhere in your community? And that, if I might, is where teachers come in. Educators are often one of the key places where a child feels like they are treated fairly and safe. And that's perhaps a little sad if you're in a dangerous community, or perhaps the family is going through a crisis. But that again points to the idea of if I'm treated fairly and I know I matter and I'm going to be valued and not, stigmatized, all of that adds up to my feeling like I'm a special person, and that has a cascade of positive effects in terms of my future orientation, what I think I'm going to become, and indeed what I actually do become.
Thank you, Madame. Merci beaucoup. The last and final question will be coming from me and myself. In your book, I Still Love You, addresses the challenges of parental separation, divorce, and maintaining loving relationships amidst changing family dynamics. How can parents and teachers effectively convey their love and support to children and students during difficult times? So as a teenager myself, I felt overwhelmed with social issues with my friends. And even if my parents said, I love you, it didn't seem to reach. I was so wrapped up in my pain or my issues that I was struggling with. So it's still not clear to me what saved me in the end. And I know there are others, teenagers in all ages, who are dealing with these types of issues. I just want to do everything I can to help my own daughter if she needs me in the future.
It's a great question. Thanks, Mark. If I might, I think sometimes we have focused almost very exclusively on that primary attachment. I mean, think about it. Everyone talks about, you just have one person who loves you. But actually, that's kind of a culturally biased idea. Most places around the world wouldn't think like that. They would actually say that you are embedded in communities, aunties and uncles. You have an extended group, a community, a faith community, a cultural community, a school community, and perhaps an online community. And so much what we understand is when children go, say, we'll take a divorce for a second. What we understand is the stress can be very quickly mitigated or tamped down if there's not overt conflict between the parents, so the child doesn't have to choose a relationship. But also what we've seen is, think about it, other systems, like for instance, if their housing quality doesn't drop, if they don't change sporting teams, if they maintain the same peer group, the same school, they don't get into this weird competition where they have a cell phone, a generation 14 cell phone in this home, but that can't travel over to this home. In other words, what we've heard time and again, the more that we look at institutional continuity, the housing continuity, structural continuity, relationship, and we think about that the holding environment isn't just the parents, it is the collective, the school, the teachers. I could talk for hours about cases where when those other systems are working well, a child comes through the crisis, whether that is a divorce or, God forbid, the death of a parent, that these moments are a child can navigate through those, but we do have to think about maybe look beyond. So I often, if I'm working with a child who's going through a divorce and experiencing parent divorce, I'm going to talk about the relationship with those, but I'm also going to talk about continuity with aunts and uncles and teachers and schools and peers and sporting teams. And I'm going to try and paint a world where there's lots of other things that haven't fractured, and how the child is being supported and maintained through that crisis, through those other moments. I mean, don't we as adults do the same? When we lose a loved one, most cultures have a way of grieving. We sit Shiva, we have Irish wakes, we go through periods of mourning, we wear black to signal that we have a loss. We do things that tell our community to support me. It's not an individual problem or even just a problem of the child and the one parent. It is a collective problem. And when those resources pull together, we tend to see better outcomes.
Thank you so much for your very, very valuable time today. As our discussion comes to a close, I want to express my gratitude for your insights and your expertise. Dr. Ungar, you have offered us profound thoughts to ponder about resilience, trauma-informed care, and other positive changes that we can do as a collective. Through your thoughtful response, we feel empowered to better support our students, and we strongly encourage all educators to seek out your many incredible books that I just looked up your name and I was amazed at the wealth of treasures that I would love all of our teachers to read and to enjoy and to use. So once again, thank you, Dr. Ungar, for your incredibly inspiring contributions to our young citizens of the world. Merci.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Everyone, have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again.
Merci, au revoir.